When human remains were found in a shallow grave in remote woodland on the 17th of December 2015 near West Calder, Glasgow, it was clear that the person involved had come to a gruesome end. At first, police could not be sure that what was found was human. The remains were not intact, and only part of the spine and skull remained. The find was particularly significant because the remains were eventually identified as none other than Martin Hamilton. Police believed that a man who was one of Scotland's most wanted criminals could have been murdered as long ago as the previous April, shortly after he was last seen alive and months before his body was discovered. So how did this once infamous gangster come to such a grisly end? And what had gone on in the previous 20 years to culminate in this moment? Known as the Black Hill Butcher, Hamilton was a feared gangland enforcer, often cited as Scotland's most hated criminal. You are watching OCG TV. It would really help us if you could subscribe to the channel. The benefit to you is that you will be alerted every time we upload a video for your enjoyment. For us, it pushes the profile of the channel in YouTube's algorithm and allows us to produce a higher number of videos for you. We thank you in advance for your support with this. Martin Hamilton was a feared and ruthless figure in the Glasgow underworld and beyond for over 30 years. The nickname was a reference to an area in the northeast of the city where he had operated for many years. He was born in the Maryhill area and grew up a few miles away in a house in Holdsworth Street, Anderston, near the Cranston Hill police station. In 1984, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison for assault with intent to cause severe injury and possession of an offensive weapon. Standing only 5 foot 5 inches tall with a chubby frame, Hamilton, who was gay, came across as an unassuming figure who was known for the excessive speed at which he spoke. However, people underestimated him at their own peril. Even as a teenager, Martin was feared and hated. His fellow school pupils would try to avoid him. If he was getting on the school bus, kids at the back would avoid him and immediately get out of the emergency door. In early 1990, he was shot on 2 separate occasions nearby his home in Glasgow. The Glasgow Evening Times ran with the headline, "Scotland's Most Hated Man," much to the dismay of Hamilton. This stuck with him throughout his career in gangland. In 1992, Hamilton, then 30, was among 4 men found guilty at the High Court in Stirling of conspiracy to rob a branch of the Dunfermline Building Society at Anniesland Cross. They were found guilty of conspiring to rob the building society, breaking in with a key and, armed with knives and an imitation handgun, lying in wait for staff to arrive to force them to hand over what the court was told could have been more than £30,000. The robbery turned farcical when after 5 to 10 minutes of entering the premises, the robbers realised it was a setup. The lead detective involved famously quoted to the media that it seemed there were only 4 people in Glasgow who had not known about the stakeout, and that was the raiders. Hamilton wasn't considered a Mr. Big in Glasgow in the 90s, dealing in drugs and committing armed robberies. Most of the city's gangsters gave Hamilton a wide berth due to his unpredictable and volatile nature. His time in Glasgow was coming to an end. He was in his late 30s now, and a freshen up in surroundings was required. After his release from prison for the siege at the Building Society, the Glasgow police force were keeping tabs on him, and the ability to move around freely was limited. Nobody recognised the small, chubby-faced man in the front seat of the car as it drove through the multi-storey blocks of Wester Hailes in Edinburgh. They would soon know the devil was coming to stay. It was 1998 when Martin Hamilton decided he had to move out of Glasgow. He was now 37 years old and had fallen out with those at the highest echelons of criminality in the city. He was given a gun and an upfront payment by legendary underworld figure Arthur Thompson to shoot rival gangster Paul Ferris. Hamilton accepted the contract, but instead told Ferris and walked away with the money without completing the hit. He was extremely brazen and held no fear of the Godfather coming after him. Hamilton had a big weakness though. He enjoyed hurting people. Again and again, he went too far. On more than 10 occasions, he faced charges of abduction and torture. 10 court cases against him collapsed, terrified witnesses withdrawing their evidence or simply becoming non-responsive to police contact. But Glasgow's underworld faces were getting fed up. If they asked Hamilton to do a job, they couldn't be sure he'd do it, or if he'd go too far with his violence, attracting additional and unnecessary attention from authorities. With his options in Glasgow dwindling, Hamilton set out for Edinburgh, with his sights set on its lucrative drugs market. He focused on the west of the city, particularly areas such as Broomhouse, Wester Hailes and Sighthill. Detectives from the Lothian and Borders Force admitted they knew little about Hamilton when he arrived. But a string of shocking assaults against low-level dealers who owed him money would bring Hamilton to their attention. His activities were so vile that police chiefs quickly put a surveillance team from their major crime unit on a round-the-clock watch. They discovered teenage dealers were supplied with heroin and ecstasy by Hamilton, but faced horrific retribution if they failed to make their repayments. The drug trade was very different from that in Glasgow. In the capital, there were faceless traffickers and local small-time dealers with very few people in between. It was ripe for takeover by someone with a hands-on approach, exactly what Hamilton specialised in. Within months, he and his crew were running much of the drug business in the west of Edinburgh. Hamilton and his crew hadn't just taken over drug dealing in some of Edinburgh's schemes, they also made their presence known in Portobello and Musselburgh, hassling publicans, club owners and businessmen. Officers identified a pub landlord who was targeted for extortion, eventually telling police that he would rather pay the $30,000 demanded than testify against him. Another landlord even did business with him. Billy Sibbald was said to have bought £100,000 worth of drugs. While Hamilton was locked up in Glenoakle prison, Sibbald thought he could forget the debt, but in November 2002, he went missing. 3 months later, his body turned up in a ditch on the outskirts of Edinburgh. He had been blasted with a shotgun. The trait that made Hamilton stand out from other criminals was the sadistic nature of the violence he dished out. There was often a sexual element, torturing and sodomizing young teenage men who had fallen into drug dealing and couldn't repay their debts. Later, when Hamilton was in prison, he was allowed to act as a listener for other inmates. A mature prisoner provides support for a vulnerable inmate. He often used it as a mechanism to get them alone and then assault them in the most despicable of ways. Hamilton was relentless, but his tactics were simple. He made local dealers an offer they couldn't refuse: work for me or face violence. Most opted to work for him. Those who didn't ended up in hospital. But then he went too far. An 18-year-old boy had gone to Hamilton's Glasgow base to get drugs, but didn't return. When his girlfriend, also 18, went to the flat, she found him unconscious on the floor. Aware of Hamilton's reputation, she started a screaming row and he punched her. She retaliated by smashing a lamp over his head. They were then driven to a flat in Glasgow's Anderston area, and the petrified couple were made to stand in the bath so the blood could be easily washed away. Then came a horrific 10-hour ordeal. Hamilton shouted out the orders and watched as a knife was pushed through their cheeks. Then they were told water was being boiled, and Hamilton went crazy, shouting, screaming and pouring it over them, scarring them for life. It wasn't the most horrific torture session Hamilton ever orchestrated, but it was his last for a long time. He had picked on 2 young people brave enough to give evidence in court. The trial was heard in Inverness to ensure the safety of witnesses and the jury. It would have been extremely risky to hold the trial in one of Hamilton's former cities. A media blackout was ordered and the couple was placed on one of the tightest witness protection programs ever seen in Scotland. The court heard of the teenagers' torture and other incidents, such as an attempt to gouge an eye out with a spoon, fingers being cut off, and people being set alight. Though found not guilty of most charges, Hamilton was convicted of the most serious. Lord Kingarth sentenced him to life with a minimum of only 9 years. When he was jailed, one senior Edinburgh detective was quoted as saying, "Hamilton is as evil as child killer Robert Black. He lured young men into his company with a supply of drugs and got them to start dealing on his behalf. If they did not come up with the goods, he would simply abduct them and sexually abuse them in the most violent ways imaginable." Detectives believed Hamilton, whom they had followed for almost 5 months, was paving the way for a high-profile Glasgow crime figure to take over Edinburgh's drugs trade after he was freed from prison. Despite still being considered dangerous, Hamilton was released on parole in September 2014 from HMP Shotts in North Lanarkshire, but by the following year had disappeared without a trace. At first, police thought he had simply done a runner. He had been due to appear at Glasgow Sheriff Court for almost immediately breaching his parole, but had failed to show. An arrest warrant was issued in April 2015, and Police Scotland also made a public appeal to find Hamilton. They described the gangster as extremely dangerous and warned the public not to approach him. In October, a further appeal was made on the BBC's Crime Watch programme, and the Crime Stoppers charity also offered a reward of £2,000 for information leading to his arrest. By this time, police were receiving intelligence that Hamilton may have come to harm, and sure enough, in December 2015, his remains were found in remote woodland near the Five Sisters Business Park in West Lothian by a dog walker. There were conflicting views at the time as to why Hamilton had been murdered. He was operating in small towns such as Blackburn in West Lothian and Harthill in North Lanarkshire, and it was thought he was trying to muscle in again on the Edinburgh drug scene. It was also said that the Glaswegian may have been targeted by Liverpool criminals after he ripped them off for £40,000. Hamilton had taken over the debts of cocaine users after their dealer was taken to hospital in a road accident. He was asked to collect the £40,000 but failed to hand over the amount to his Liverpool bosses. There is possibly some truth to that theory, as in January 2017, Liverpool-born James Farrelly, who lived locally in West Lothian, was arrested and charged with his murder. Prosecutors allege Farrelly shot Hamilton in the head with a firearm, then inflicted sharp and blunt force injuries to his head between April 16 and December 17, 2015. Farrelly, nicknamed Scouse, was also charged with attempting to defeat the ends of justice by dumping the body in woodland. He faced further allegations of being involved in the supply of hard drugs, all of which he denied. However, he never stood trial. A life of addiction had taken its toll on the Liverpudlian, and in March 2017 he was freed from Sawton Prison in Edinburgh because he was dying from cancer. Martin Hamilton's eventual funeral was delayed for 8 months because of the police investigation. The 20-minute ceremony in August 2016 eventually took place at Glasgow's Maryhill Crematorium with only a handful of mourners in attendance. A death notice the previous week had described Hamilton as a beloved son to his mother Margaret, loving brother, much-loved uncle, great-uncle and friend. To everyone else, he was, well, let's just say, a very different character. You have been watching OCG TV. Had you heard of Martin Hamilton before this video? Who do you think is the most hated criminal in your country? We would be intrigued to know. Let us know in the comments. Till next time, take care.